Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Dania Thafer, the Executive Director of Gulf International Forum. We are pleased to have Dr. Mehran Kamrava to join us for a book talk on his new edited book, the Routledge Handbook of Persian Gulf Politics. The book provides a comprehensive, up-to-date analysis of Persian Gulf politics, history, economics, and society. It comprises of a total of 36 individual contributors and authors for chapters. Some of them include some of our non-resident fellows, which are Dr. Courtney Freer, Dr. Galdat Bahgat, and Dr. Christian Ulrichsen. I wish I could name all the authors, but I think I would keep you here for a while to go through that comprehensive list, but you can find it online. The book is approximately 500 pages long and is divided into 6 sections highlighting historical dynamics, society and culture, economic development, domestic politics, regional security dynamics, and looking at the Gulf region and the world. So I recommend looking for that. I know when I was eyeing resources for my course this fall that I'm teaching at Georgetown, I was looking for something comprehensive that talks about the Gulf, and this just fell in my lap. So we're very pleased to have you, Dr. Kamrava. He's a professor, Dr. Kamrava is a professor at Georgetown in Qatar. He served as the founding director of the Center for International and Regional Studies. He has several books, including his book, The Concise History of Revolution, Troubled Waters, Insecurity in the Persian Gulf, Inside the Arab State, The Impossibility of Palestine, History, Geography, and the Road Ahead, and Qatar, Small State, Big Politics. If you haven't read his work, then you haven't been reading on the Gulf, because he's published from all perspectives of Gulf issues that you could think of. With that said, I would like to welcome Dr. Kamrava and look forward to hearing some of your insights on your new book.
Thank you, Dania. Let me begin by thanking you and your team at the Gulf International Forum for this opportunity and for this time to be with you. I'm very grateful. I was approached by Routledge about 2 years ago to see if I wanted to put together a handbook. And I have to say that initially I was reluctant because I wasn't sure about the utility of such a massive project and undertaking. And I spoke to a number of colleagues, and they all, to my pleasant surprise, said what you mentioned, which is that there is much need for a rather comprehensive book on the politics, history, culture, society, and economics of the Persian Gulf region. And I was incredibly lucky to be able to convince a number of colleagues to collaborate and to contribute original chapters to this volume. As you mentioned, along with me, there are 35 other contributors. And these contributors are, as you mentioned, not only alums of the Gulf International Forum, but some of the best and the brightest of the minds of of Gulf politics and history. And I am really grateful to these contributors for the trust they put in me, and for the trust and the confidence they showed in making contributions. And in approaching and in putting together list of contributions and list of contributors, I decided to go for a balance of those who were early in their careers and were just beginning to study the region, as well as those who had spent their careers for years, if not decades, having studied the region. And I also made sure that we give priority to voices from the region. So one of the things I'm proud of in terms of the book is the number of scholars based in places like Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, or scholars who know the region from inside. Some of the names you mentioned, Christian Ulrichsen, Courtney Freer. These are scholars who know this region inside out, even if right now they may not necessarily be based here. Jesse Moritz comes to mind. And so again and again, I was fortunate to be able to get these contributors to be with, to collaborate. And the goal was to put together as comprehensive of a collection as possible. Now, every time you undertake a project like this, by necessity, you cannot include every dimension of regional politics. But our goal was to be as comprehensive as possible. And so, as you mentioned, there are 6 sections beginning with historical context, looking at culture, society, economics, politics, and diplomacy. And so, in my view, all of these, of course, are different pieces of a puzzle that together make up the complex that is Persian Gulf politics.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrava. You mentioned in the book that you found the study of politics is akin to the peeling of an onion. And that was kind of mentioned as a metaphor on how the book is multi-layered and multi-dimensional. Can you discuss how this book captures much of that complexity when it comes to the politics of the Persian Gulf? What was the main goal of producing this edited volume, and who is your target audience?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. To me, politics is incredibly complex. Social sciences in general and politics in particular is the result of multiple causes. It is seldom monocausal. And so one of the things we see is, and one of the metaphors I use in the book, is that the study of politics is like peeling an onion. If you look at an onion under a microscope, a layer of onion, it's very fine. It is made up of almost infinite and very complex intertwined patterns. And then you will see that right underneath that fine layer is another layer, which is equally complex, and then another and another. And that is exactly what politics in general is. And a region as complex and as tormented as the Persian Gulf, its politics is particularly complicated and complex, and it does not lend itself to simple analysis. And that is why I decided to take such a multidisciplinary approach to the study of the politics of the region, beginning with historical dynamics that have shaped it and moving on to its global and regional engagements. You also asked who the intended audience of the book is. And one of the goals that I hope this book is successful at is that it can be read at different levels. If you read some of the contributions, you will see that they speak at multiple levels. These contributions speak to fellow academics and scholars and experts on the Persian Gulf. They speak to graduate students, they speak to undergraduate students, and they speak to casual observers. So the contributions in themselves and the book as a whole can be read at multiple levels and can have multiple audiences. So it isn't necessarily written as a book by scholars for scholars. Of course, scholars are going to be its primary audiences, but my intent and my hope is that it can,
or absence of colonial or hegemonic powers. Could you explain that? Why is that?
Yes. One of the things we see in the region is the pervasiveness, both in contemporary times as well as historically, of non-regional actors, beginning with the Portuguese, then of course the Ottomans, the British, and finally the Americans today. And so this region has been heavily penetrated by global actors from outside the region. And I think it is important, it is critically important for us to delve into this history and the lingering historical legacies, not just geographic, but otherwise, of this deep colonial penetration and presence in the region, and the legacies that it has left on ruling families, on national boundaries, on trade patterns, and on security concerns as we see today.
Okay, and for the next section, which is the society and culture section of the book, I noticed that is very broad in nature. It discusses family dynamics and within the social fabric of the Arabian Peninsula, to women's roles in the economy, to art and culture. Why did you choose such a broad spectrum of topics when you talked about the society and culture of the Persian Gulf region?
One of the objectives, first of all, I should say that for each of the sections, history, society, and culture, economics, I had some broad ideas. And then I would approach the contributors and I'd say, well, I think we ought to have a section, for example, on the legacy of Ottoman rule. We ought to have a section on the role of women in the labor market. We ought to have it. And I would say, and there would be a dialogue that would ensue between me and the contributors in terms of they're the experts on that specific topic. And a couple of guiding principles was, what is it that is important? What is it that needs to be studied more? And what is it that can be contributed to the literature that is original, but hasn't necessarily received the scholarly attention that it deserves? And so some of the topics are not only, for example, the historical topics are pillars of and chronological periodization of the region. But when it comes to society and culture, one of the questions that I would always pose to the contributors is that, what are some of the topics that you as the expert think are important but need to be emphasized and have been understudied? So there's a combination when it comes to the collection as a whole of topics that are essential to understanding each of those areas, but there are also topics that I think need to be highlighted and have not necessarily been studied. Art and artistic production, for example, is one. The role of women in the labor market is another. So, excuse me, some of the topics are designed to highlight some of these areas that I think need much greater attention and elaboration.
Yes, I'm looking forward to reading the one about the family dynamics in the Arabian Peninsula.
It's an excellent chapter written by my Georgetown colleague, Professor Amira Sambal, and I'm really thrilled to have all of the chapters, including that one, in the book.
You mentioned when you were talking about this book about bringing in regional voices into this publication. And, you know, I mean, right now there's an ongoing debate about knowledge production and, you know, I think all regions, but we're talking about the Gulf region particularly. And so was that kind of taking into consideration in your overall strategy? I know there's a lot of debates now also in academia about decolonizing, for lack of a better word, if you will, the syllabi. And was that kind of something that you took into account in this work? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
You know, as you mentioned, I directed the Center for International and Regional Studies here in Georgetown for 13 years. And the fact that Georgetown is here and the fact that the center is here, CIRS, Research Institute, and other centers like Center for Economic and Social Research Survey at Qatar University, and there are others. These are meant to not only generate knowledge, but present a window from the inside. I discovered myself, I thought I knew the Middle East before I came and lived and worked here. I had actually written a book called The Modern Middle East that came out in 2005. And I moved to Qatar in 2007. And once I came here a couple of years and I saw the region from within, then I realized that my perspective has changed. My approach, my understanding of the region has changed. And so it wasn't so much decolonizing the study of the Middle East that guided my choice of contributors and my discussion with contributors. It was the fact that I realized that my own perspective, my own view, my own worldview of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf region and Arabian Peninsula had changed. And I, quite frankly, realized that there was a lot that I didn't know before looking at the region from within and doing research over a sustained and prolonged period of time in the region. And so it was with that guide and with that principle, that assumption, that I decided to make sure that there's a fair amount of regional voices in the book.
Okay. And moving to the economic development section, which is an area that I focus on, I noticed that half of the section was dedicated to the labor market. So migration, the division of labor, women in the labor market. Can you elaborate on how this book engages some of these important issues with regards to the labor, and why the dedication to the labor market specifically?
You know, that's an excellent question. Any visitor to the region is struck by the pervasiveness of migrant labor. And anyone who reads any of the journalistic accounts of countries like Qatar or Kuwait, UAE, is convinced that they know an awful lot about the conditions of migrant workers. And there's a lot of information, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of misinformation and misconception. Migrant labor is the heart and soul of economic development here in the Persian Gulf. Without them, the massive infrastructural development and the appearance of these cities that grow into the sea and into the sky would not have been possible. But there's also a lot of misperception and misconception about migrant labor, about the management of the migration process, about the conditions of migrant workers in the region, about the legal regimes that govern their economic as well as their personal lives, about their exploitation and their conditions. And so it was with that assumption that, to the extent that was possible, I was fortunate to have colleagues who are experts on these topics who agreed to make contributions to the book. So I think one of the book's most valuable contributions is these chapters that shed light on topics that are often talked about but frequently misunderstood and not necessarily and people don't understand them. And of course, this is not a topic that can be easily discussed in the course of 3 or 4 chapters. There have been books written on this. I co-edited with one of the contributors to the volume, Zahra Baber, a book that came out in 2011 called Migrant Labor in the Persian Gulf. And so it is a vast topic that is evolving, that is changing. Our knowledge of it is evolving. And it is a topic that I think is critical to be highlighted. Having said that, that section on the economy also has, in addition to the focus on migrant labor, what I think are pieces by some of the best scholars on rentierism, Jesse Moritz and Courtney Freer. And I was truly fortunate to have those contributions by scholars that I think are either stars already or rising stars in the field.
Absolutely, I would agree with that as well. And Zahra Babar, who you mentioned, is a prolific publisher on labor issues, and I'd recommend anyone to follow her work if they want to look at migrant labor issues in the Gulf. So segueing to the 4th section of the book, the domestic politics section, I noticed that there was a focus on nationalism in Iran and the broader Gulf region. And what trends does this book witness in regards to the rise of nationalism in the Gulf region?
Probably the culprit for the focus on nationalism is me, because one of the things I was doing alongside with this work was I was looking at revolutions historically, from the French Revolution on to the Arab Spring. And one of the themes that I discovered was pervasive in all revolutions, regardless of whether they are communist or not, regardless of the rhetoric and their ideological coloring, is the pervasive and the compelling force of nationalism. And when you look at the Middle East in general and the Persian Gulf in particular, you discover that that pervasiveness of nationalism is particularly true in terms of this region. And whether it is Iran and its ostensibly Islamic government, or it is a country like Iraq that is in the midst of a prolonged political turmoil, or country like Saudi Arabia with its young and ambitious heir apparent, or United Arab Emirates that is flexing its muscles militarily across the Middle East, or a country like Qatar that is under embargo, and there is tremendous sense of patriotism, particularly since 2017. In any of these countries, regardless of their pattern of historical development, regardless of the official ideology of the state, regardless of the personalities that are dominating the highest echelons of the state, nationalism is a compelling, powerful force in all of these. And I think any book that looks at the politics of the Middle East in general and the Persian Gulf in particular would be remiss if it didn't highlight this continuing pervasive force.
Yes, I think that nationalism is an important issue that has colored, especially some of the domestic politics in the region. I would have to agree with that. Going on to the fifth part of the book, looking at regional security, which is another area that I focus on, I see that there are IR, international relations, buzzwords such as security dilemmas, anarchy, conflict spirals. Why are these terms emphasized with regards to these chapters? And from the perspective of the book, how does it relate to the current state of security of the Gulf region? And I also noticed that there's a little bit of emphasis on Saudi and Iran as they have two chapters dedicated to them. Could you elaborate on that as well?
Yes, thank you for that question. First of all, we all know that this region is one of the most militarized in the world, and that every year there's a record military sale as compared to the year before by one regional state or another. And yet, ironically, despite its increasing militarization, in fact, because of this militarization, the region is highly insecure. And so it's important to look at factors such as the security dilemma, whereby one country enhances its security and at the same time makes another one insecure, and therefore a vicious cycle ensues in which there's an arms race and there is pervasive insecurity. And so some of these buzzwords of IR, as you mentioned, like anarchy, security dilemma, conflict spirals, these are indeed phenomena that do characterize the international politics of this region. We see it all around us. In fact, we see it, those of us who live here, see it viscerally in terms of how deeply and how pervasively securitized this region is. In fact, it used to be that in some countries of the region, you could easily go and do social science research. And we know that many social scientists, or at least a number of them, have found themselves in deep trouble, have been imprisoned because of what is rather innocuous, innocent social science research. And so something as simple as and as routine as going and interviewing policymakers has become securitized. So it's important when you look at the international politics of the region to highlight some of these factors. Now, you also asked about the emphasis on Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think it would be wrong to say that Iran and Saudi Arabia are the two main culprits of the insecurity of the region. But they are big players. They're not the only culprits, but they're big players. And of course, since 2011, this strategic competition has assumed sectarian coloring and has assumed sectarian rhetoric. And it has then, as a result, given rise to other dimensions that have become important to study. So indeed, these are important states and important actors, and they're important security players in the region.
Okay, and so the sixth part, the Persian Gulf and the world, I noticed that there seemed to be a strong emphasis on the U.S. role in the region, with some focus on China. And I mean, that's understandable. But in the book, what are the major arguments posed with regards to these two powerful and arguably competing actors?
Some of the arguments are, and one of the themes that runs through almost all of the book, is that this is a region where actors are primarily security dependent. The only regional actor that considers itself security independent is Iran. And that is because of force of circumstances, historical developments, its peculiar international relations, and the ripple effects of its revolution in 1978-79. But almost all other regional actors consider themselves dependent on an outside security provider. And one of the things we see is that many of these countries, many of these states feel that they have to align themselves with the interests of an outside security provider, in this case, namely the United States, in order to be able to protect themselves against threats. And whether those threats come from the broader region or come from next door. So we know, for example, that in 2017, when the Gulf crisis occurred, later on it was revealed by an article in the New York Times that the United Arab Emirates was going to invade Qatar. And the only reason it didn't invade was because the Americans didn't give it a green light. So the Americans play a fundamentally important security role here. And it is important to highlight this security role. Now, there is also the fact that this pervasive security role, this fundamental security role, is ironically itself the cause of much insecurity. And so it is important from an analytical perspective to decipher and dissect this very important and almost overwhelming footprint that the United States has in the region militarily. China, of course, is a rising global power. So far, it has not been an important and consequential military actor in the Persian Gulf. It has so far limited its military to the South China Sea, its military presence. But certainly it is an actor to watch, and it is an important customer for the region's energy supplies. And so it is important to also highlight that. And again, I was fortunate to get Jonathan Fulton, who is Professor Fulton, who is in the UAE, to write the chapter on that.
Okay, excellent. So we have a couple of questions that I'd like to share with you. One is about the Sykes-Picot agreement, which in the view of the person that posed the question, determined a lot of the future of the different nation states in the Middle East, whether it's Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Israel. And how does this decision of establishing such sheikdoms, I guess they're referring to the Gulf, to be, how does it affect the current politics of the region? So this is kind of a historical question.
Yeah, I beg to differ. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is often assumed to have drawn the boundaries of the region. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, in fact, didn't draw the boundaries of the region. What it did was it divided the region into spheres of influence, and it showed the broad guidelines for colonial actors, namely Britain and France, that they could come to some sort of modus vivendi over the shape and the future, political future and fortunes of the region. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement wasn't as important in terms of shaping the current boundaries of the Persian Gulf as was later British influence. And so one of the things we see was the alliance of Britain with local ruling elites that in turn turned tribal leaders into state makers and into ruling dynasties. And so this came somewhat historically separate and later. And of course, there are unique national developments. I'm generalizing here, but it wasn't so much the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The point that the question does raise is important because the fact that Britain was involved at the inception of state building processes in many ways shaped this security dependence that we see today. The fact that it was through alliance with and through at least collaboration with the global superpower of the time when local elites were able to establish their dominance and supremacy within their territories. And that, of course, shaped from the very beginning this relationship of dependence between local elites and outside security providers, so much so that in 1968, when Britain announced its withdrawal from the Persian Gulf region, what later became the UAE, political elites went to Britain from the UAE and said, don't leave, we will underwrite your military expenses, and Britain left anyway. So you see that level of security dependence that has its roots historically.
Okay, there's another question, and by the way, these questions are from the audience, not from me. It's in regards to nationalism, asking you to define it, I guess, from the view of the book. And the individual asked or stated that the sense of nationalism is completely different from one country to the other. For example, they mentioned Qatar versus Syria or Lebanon. And how do you weigh in on the rise of nationalism? Is the increase a sense of being, as an example, Qatari, or a collective nationalism as a Gulfi, which is, I guess, Pan-Arabism? Please elaborate on your definition of nationalism, essentially. That's what they asked.
Thank you. This is an excellent question, and I want to thank the audience member for asking it. As the question rightly observes, nationalism is context specific. in many ways, nationalism, in broadest, simplest terms, is identification with the motherland. And it can have various consequences or various manifestations, everything from love of a piece of territory or a geographic landscape to patriotism and jingoism. Sometimes nationalism is agitated by the spread of the printing press and the ability to imagine yourself as part of the same community. Sometimes it is agitated as a result of some outside invasion or outside force. Sometimes it is as a result of otherness and an awareness of difference. What we see in the Persian Gulf region is the rise of relatively new states. These are states that are still in processes of building themselves. And in many ways, if you look in broader historical terms, these are states in many ways that went through their adolescence in the 1990s. They are relatively young, many of them born in the 1970s, many of them, or late 60s, early 70s, many of them are now realizing that they have the resources, the ability, the capacities to not only defend themselves, but to shape the destinies of countries near and far. And this is what we saw particularly in the aftermath of the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings of 2011. This is what we're seeing right now. And so again and again, what we're seeing is this rise today of nationalism that had existed, of course, but had lain dormant. And we see this nationalism manifests itself in different ways. In Qatar, after 2017, we saw larger than life pictures of the emir because of the blockade. In a place like Dubai, we saw in the 1990s and in the 2000s the rise of amazing cityscapes. And in Abu Dhabi today, we're seeing Abu Dhabi's military might and flexing its muscles in the Red Sea, in Yemen, elsewhere. In Saudi Arabia, we're seeing the rise of nationalism with Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the changes that are being undertaken there. So what we see in the Persian Gulf region today is heightened sense of nationalism, and this heightened sense of nationalism is manifesting itself differently depending on national contexts and depending on the state within which it's being articulated.
Okay, and next question, and you can probably discuss this as it relates to your book, maybe the security section, but some in the past have suggested that smaller Gulf states have a schizophrenic view of Saudi Arabia. From their view, it's both an ally and a threat. Would you comment on that thought as it relates to the book?
That description is actually not far off the mark. And I think in many ways, this attitude, this ambivalence that characterizes the relationship between some of the smaller states and Saudi Arabia is largely what explains the state of the Gulf Cooperation Council today. On the one hand, there is fraternal ties. Saudi Arabia, of course, is home to Islam's two holiest sites. It can be considered the leader of the Islamic world because it houses Mecca, because every Muslim in his or her lifetime goes to Hajj, and it's one of the main pillars of Islam. Everyone points towards Mecca during prayer. And so Saudi Arabia is an important player. But at the same time, it does have a perception of itself because of its size, because of its population, because of its history, because of its historic role, that it sees itself as the first among equals in the GCC. It sees itself as the bigger brother to the UAE and to Kuwait and to Qatar and to Bahrain and Oman. And this self-perception is not always viewed with acquiescence in regional capitals, in Kuwait City and in Doha and Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Manama and Muscat and other cities and elsewhere. So yes, there is this, I don't want to go so far as to say love-hate relationship, but there's definitely a sense of ambivalence. On the one hand, there are fraternal ties. There's this recognition of Saudi Arabia as the birthplace of Islam and as home to Islam's holiest places. But at the same time, there's the political reality of Saudi Arabia as the regional superpower. And there's a political reality of Saudi Arabia as a heavyweight, which isn't always viewed it isn't always seen as a benign actor elsewhere in the region.
Okay, another question is, it relates to kind of my questions that I asked about security in the region, but takes a different angle. You were asked to provide more insights on the changing dynamic of Israel's relationship with different Gulf states, while keeping in mind Iran and lately the increasing role of Turkey after the embargo. This is not from me, this is from the audience.
Right, right. Well, look, it isn't just Iran and Turkey, because even countries that have ostensibly cordial relations with Iran, such as Qatar and Oman, are tripping over themselves to establish relations or at least to be on friendly terms with Israel. There are several factors involved. First of all, of course, there has been, and now it's become official, there has been an almost complete abandonment of the Palestinian cause by the regional states. There's realpolitik has taken over, and there's been a complete abandonment of Palestinians or Palestine, and they don't even bother with the rhetoric that they once did, the regional actors. Part of it is to be on the good graces of the Americans because of security dependence, because of strategic considerations. Part of it certainly is because of Iran. Certainly the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have become so chummy with Israel is because of the Iran factor. And part of it is because of an assumption of broader strategic trends, that Israel is here to stay. It's an important actor regionally and globally, and we might as well not fall too far behind in establishing relations, because if the Emiratis and the Saudis are establishing relations, we, the Qataris, and we, the Omanis, shouldn't be too far behind. And so, of course, all of this is couched in the rhetoric of development in Gaza, development assistance in Gaza, and strategic common interests The UAE is very blunt in talking about strategic common interests with Israel, but of course, Israel is an important factor. It isn't so much Turkey that is a factor. What factor there is Iran and Israel in itself and the United States. So for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their relationship with Israel is important because of Iran, and for Qatar, its relationship with Israel is important because of the United States. And for all of them, it's important because Israel is here to stay. And it is an important strategic actor. And of course, it is an important provider of software and cybersecurity software and other weapons, actually.
The next question from the audience: would you imagine? Sorry, it starts out with "you imagine," but let me get to the core of the question. Basically, one of the audience members said that there wasn't a dedicated chapter to Yemen, the war in Yemen, and is the Gulf's relationship with Yemen addressed in this book? That's
not yes, it is, but not directly. It is addressed in the context of other topics, but not necessarily Yemen and the civil war. Anytime you have a book like this, you're bound to have some blind spots. Not deliberately, but as it is, this book has 36 chapters. I actually had to negotiate with the publisher. There is a chapter which is written by the brilliant Farah Al-Nakib, and this chapter is 17,000 words. It's an absolutely brilliant chapter on modernity in Kuwait, and the chapters are meant to be 7,000 to 10,000 words, and I didn't want to. It was too good of a chapter to be stopped, but you have to make calls. As it is, the book is, as you mentioned, it's actually 560 pages long. And, there are a number of topics in any of the sections you mentioned. There could be 6 or 7 additional chapters in order for that section on culture, economy, politics, international relations to be comprehensive. And so each of those sections could have at least 10 chapters. And so, yes, there isn't a chapter on Yemen. It isn't because it's not important, but you have to make difficult choices. And some of these difficult choices are guided by scholars that have the time to contribute, by the length of the book, by, at some point you have to make some very difficult calls, and this was one of those very difficult calls. By no means does this mean that the topic is unimportant or something that we didn't want to discuss, but there are many other topics that could be in the chapter, but in the book, in the collection. But of course, we had to make a call at some point. And I'm sorry, I think there was a second part to your question.
How was Yemen addressed in the book?
Well, Yemen is important because it is, Saudi Arabia has been trying to resolve the Yemen problem for decades. Yemen is not a new or recent development in so far as regional security dynamics are concerned. So Yemen is addressed in terms of the multiple security dimensions. It is addressed in terms of migration and migratory patterns. There isn't a dedicated chapter on the Yemen civil war, but in terms of migration, in terms of security dynamics, in terms of collapsed states, all of these are addressed in one form or another throughout the book.
Yeah. Well, this brings me to an interesting point. As I graduated with my PhD, and everyone asked me, "Well, don't you feel so knowledgeable now?" I said, "Actually, I feel less knowledgeable because you realize how in depth you can engage one topic, and one topic can go on for 500 pages. So I understand the dilemma that you're facing with regards to trying to have a comprehensive book, but it's impossible to be fully comprehensive at the same time, especially from a scholarly perspective. And there is a question about domestic politics and the discussion of democracy towards it or against it. This is one of the questions from the audience members. Have you engaged the issue of democracy in the Gulf region in this volume?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a number of chapters that look at democracy or lack thereof, and why is it that the region has had its particular patterns of political development. So chapters by Courtney Freer and by Jesse Moritz in particular are two that come to my mind that look specifically at political economies of the region that in many ways undermine or have ossified and frozen particular political institutions in their place and don't allow for these political institutions to change from their current authoritarian framing.
Excellent. Well, are there any closing remarks you'd like to make about this book before?
Well, there's a question. It says, is there any hope for the Hope Security Pact offer by Iran? I think this is an excellent question. Towards the end of his administration, President Obama said Saudi Arabia and Iran need to learn to share the region. And the Iranians have, to their credit, been coming out with peace initiatives. Even if these peace initiatives are mere rhetoric, at least they're saying the right things. And it would be ideal if other regional actors could even have the right rhetoric. So I don't think so, unfortunately. I don't think there's any hope for the Hope Initiative. And particularly, the reason is that the outside guidance that is needed, namely the United States, is absent. And so I think, unfortunately, I would hate, Dania, to end our conversation on a pessimistic note, but unfortunately, the insecurity of the region is likely to continue for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I think we should end with that. And of course, this question itself can have a whole volume dedicated to it. Well, thank you, Dr. Kamrava, for discussing this book with us today. We wish we could have had the other authors, but that would be a very large panel. But I look forward to reading this book and looking at it for both my academic endeavors as well as my policy work. And I recommend all of you to also check out the book. I know that you said the status of the book is still, there's a backlog at the publishers, but I think the online version is already out and available. And yes, since we are in a virtual world now, the online version should suffice. Okay.
Thank you, Dania. May I take this opportunity to reiterate my thanks to you and to your team for this opportunity and for this time, and to once again thank all the contributors for honoring me with their chapters.
It is our pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.